Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Coexisting with COVID Lunch and Learn. We're excited to have our friends at Moat Casey and Associates here today to talk to us a little bit about the impact of the pandemic as it relates to districts' budgets and operations. We do want to inform you all that we are recording this webinar, and we will share this afterwards with those who were unable to attend today, or any of you who are interested in reviewing any of the information that we shared today. We will also be live tweeting, so for any of you that want to engage with that, we would love for you to. You can engage with us at FastGrowth Texas, which is our Twitter handle, and we'd love for you to tweet any thoughts that you have as we go throughout this presentation, and of course engage with our live tweets as you see them. We do want to continue these webinars throughout the school year as we start and get back to the school year. Since things have changed a little bit, our lunch and learns will look a little bit different, but this is kind of our first attempt at that. So we do want to continue some of these. We have great partners, as you see flashing across the screen right now, but so many great partners with some great information to share, as well as we will stay on top of the relevant topics that are happening and make sure we're getting that information to our members and partners as well. As always, thank you to our valued partners. Again, you see those flashing across the screen. We see many of those that have joined us today, and we're always happy to have all of you as a part of our team at Fast Growth. A few announcements before we get started, and these are really related to the topic at hand today. The Fast Growth Schools Coalition has participated in and signed on to a few letters in the last few weeks, both at the federal and state level. And if you'll go onto our Twitter account, you'll be able to see those and access those. But one, at the federal level, we've been working with a federal coalition that's focused on school facilities, and it's called the BASIC Coalition. We have issued 2 letters as a part of that coalition. One focused on some immediate federal investment in any of the future relief or stimulus packages that is aimed at emergency building repairs and system renewals for public schools in some of our highest poverty communities across the country. The other has been to encourage inclusion of the Rebuild America's Schools Act into any infrastructure bills coming out of Congress. So as Congress continues to work on some relief and stimulus packages related to COVID-19, we will continue to engage there and bring up these topics of necessary and needed funding for schools, and particularly school facilities. We also signed on to a letter here at the state level to Governor Abbott and other state leaders that will also be posted on our Twitter account shortly. It was very much focused on issues as it relates to reopening schools. And certainly all of you who have been following that have seen some evolving things go on with that topic lately, and we'll continue to be a part of that conversation and make sure that Fast Growth specific issues are a part of that conversation, as well as all of the issues that you face as school districts. Again, you can see both of those on our Twitter account, so please make sure you look at those and read those letters. There's some great information and advocacy in those. Also, don't forget about our COVID-19 resource page that we have. We have some new resources that we shared out via email yesterday from our partners at the College Board and Huckabee. The College Board has a scholarship opportunity, a resource that is helpful for rising seniors as they are planning and preparing for college. So make sure that you're aware of that and sharing that with those that need to see it, as well as Huckabee. And Huckabee has, of course, been doing their More Momentum series, and they have 3 new webinars up on the topics of municipal bonds, real estate, and construction. So some great new information there, and we hope you will take a look at all of those. As we go through this webinar, please use the chat feature and submit any questions. I will help monitor those. And as I turn it over to Dan and Casey, Dan and Catherine, if we need to interrupt anything with questions as we go or follow up with the Q&A at the end, we will make sure that we do that. we have our friends at Fast Growth, our school finance consultants in Moat Casey and Associates. And today we have Dan Casey, who's a partner at Moat Casey, and Catherine Knepp, who is an associate there. And many of you know both of them. Dan has 40 years of experience in public school and governmental finance experience, and his vast knowledge and expertise on these topics are very valued by Fast Growth, and we know that he will share a lot of great information today. And Catherine joined Moat Casey in 2017. She's reported on the legislature, and she conducts analyses for school spending at the state and district level. I'm sure many of you have worked with her and Dan. Catherine also taught for 6 years in the Austin area, so brings that great and unique perspective as well. So I will turn it over to our friends at Moat Casey, and again, please use the chat feature and we'll monitor it and make sure that we get your questions answered.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen now so that we can view our presentation for today. So there we go. So today we're going to talk a lot about some of the things that TEA has been putting out in terms of guidance the last couple of weeks. As with all of these particular presentations go, especially this summer, and as this pandemic has gone on, clearly this guidance changes constantly. So what may be true right now is probably not going to be true in totality at 3 o'clock this afternoon when we all tune into the commissioner call. So keep that in mind. I do want to encourage folks to share their feedback, ask questions, that kind of thing, because clearly we can take a different look at some of these pieces of guidance with your feedback, because sometimes we don't always know what's going on specifically on the ground. So here's what we know. So first of all, we're going to do a foundation school program update. Then we will continue with the federal funding update, and then get a little bit of a sneak peek at the state budget update and 87th session preview. So I'll be covering the first couple of topics, and then Dan will take on the last section. So first of all, many of you are very well aware of some of this guidance that TEA has put out recently. I'll review some of that here in the state funding section. So ADA calculations in this coming year will depend on the method of instructional delivery. Minimum attendance requirements for class credit will apply regardless of the type of delivery. And students that were enrolled in private school or homeschooled in 2019-20 are not eligible for funding through remote instruction. There are several exceptions that apply. Basically, students that were in schools that no longer exist this year, or there's limited operation, where they literally were forced out. I think those students have some exceptions. But generally speaking, if you have a whole bunch of kids that were enrolled in private school that are just trying to be instructed remotely this year through your services, you will not receive funding for them. Now, it's important to note that this is only for remote instruction. So just keep that in mind. Again, 4 methods of instructional delivery. I created this little chart just to help organize thinking, because they will be funding these according to 4 different streams of attendance taking methods. So first, of course, we have in-person and Texas Virtual School Network attendance. Those 2 have always been around, and so those will continue to be funded as they always have been. But then, of course, we have these 2 new instructional delivery methods, in synchronous and asynchronous, which clearly we've given some feedback to the governor about how those methods will operate, but here are the rules as we know them right now. So first of all, schools must offer in-person instruction daily for every student in every grade level. There are, of course, some exceptions, which include closure of schools as directed by state law. I put a little asterisk there because it looks like we're gonna add by local health order as well to that list. Partial or complete closure of schools due to an outbreak of coronavirus or other illness or hazard. So clearly kids that were in contact with children that had COVID-19 are not allowed to come to school. And then also at the start of school transition period, whatever that ends up being after this negotiation process concludes, if the district can stand up remote instruction for all students. And then of course, if you have a system where you've committed students to one particular instructional delivery system or another for a particular grading period, those students would be expected to maintain that commitment. And then of course, the second instructional delivery method is through the Texas Virtual School Network. I know we have several school districts in fast growth that make use of this network. So of course, full-time virtual campuses can continue to receive funding for those students, and then students must complete the Texas Virtual School Network program and receive passing grades. Theirs is not based upon minutes of instruction or engagement. Instead, it's based upon passing and proficiency. So the agency, though, announced these two different methods for students receiving instruction remotely. And as mentioned in the letter that we put out as an organization, there are a lot of details in this guidance. So I want to make sure we hammer through each of those items. So first of all, remote synchronous instruction is two-way real-time instruction between teachers and students. So just like we're doing now over Zoom, the closest thing that you can have to in-person instruction, but just deploying it on a virtual pathway. And then remote asynchronous instruction is instruction delivered in a way where students and teachers are working independently through either pre-recorded videos or assigned readings and worksheets, but where they're not communicating in real time. The attendance methods vary, of course, according to the methods of instructional delivery. So for example, with synchronous, teachers will take attendance much like they do on campus, probably the simplest thing, where students logged in at a documented time, whether that's via a technological accounting system or just by a show of hands on Zoom and the teacher counts. If they are present and they fulfill the minutes requirements, they can be marked as present remote synchronous for the day. So it's important that the minutes be fulfilled for synchronous funding purposes. And then for asynchronous, attendance will be taken every day based upon student engagement, so not based upon minutes. And the daily progress documented in a learning management system or through completion and turning in of assignments. So a little bit fuzzier in terms of exactly how much a kid is interacting with school every day, but there is evidence that they have done something. Then in eligible grade levels, we've got synchronous and asynchronous. And this is where a lot of the complexity in terms of planning can come in, because pre-K to 2, you cannot do 100% synchronous instruction. Of course, you can have a check-in meeting on Zoom. It's not that you can't use some sort of real-time instruction. It's just that you're not supposed to depend upon that for the majority of your instruction. And then grades 3 through 5 has to have 3 hours of instructional minutes for full funding. That does not have to be continuous, of course. And then same thing for grades 6 through 12, 240 instructional minutes required for full funding. So it's important to note that this is instructional minutes, and these numbers are different from your operational minutes for in-person instruction. So while you probably won't get to 75,600 minutes in direct instruction, that's okay because you're doing it through synchronous. And then asynchronous, all grade levels can generate ADA under approved asynchronous learning plans. Then here's where the required approval comes into play. So synchronous, you have to sign an attestation assuring that the plan that you have will meet certain requirements. The checklist is there at the link. When you guys get a PDF of this, you'll be able to click on that. It's online. Many of you have probably taken a look at it. And then asynchronous districts will be required to apply to TEA for a waiver, and then they'll have to submit an application that includes a description of their instructional plan. Here's an important note, something that's kind of buried more into the FAQs, is that you as a district must also submit a separate plan for approval to mark students who have originally committed to either synchronous or in-person instruction to be counted present under asynchronous when they cannot fulfill the minutes under synchronous or they're not present in class. So this is your backup plan to try to get funding for kids who, maybe were supposed to show up to the Zoom call that day and didn't, and then the teacher can contact them and say, hey, can you please just fill out this worksheet and send it back to me today? That way I can show you as present. You have to have a separate plan for that. And then letters of intent could be submitted now for asynchronous plans. And then TEA has not yet released the application plan for the window for plan approval, but they will shortly. And then of course there are these hold harmless provisions that we've already had some discussion about as a group. But first, the first hold harmless is that TEA will exclude the first 2 attendance periods from your annual average if your data shows a drop of more than 1% compared to the same periods in 2019-20, and a historical ratio based on attendance in 2018-19 will be applied to your ADA counts from this year. So basically they're using the last quote normal year 2018-19 and using that as a measure, like a yardstick, to see kind of where you would have been in 2021 if we had had normal school. And of course it's a 1% drop compared to the same periods last year. And then remote asynchronous ADA will be funded through the first 3 attendance periods without an approved plan. So they're giving everybody a pretty long runway to get those plans approved. And then unapproved instructional plans after the holidays will not be funded. So here's the other important piece. TA will also implement a cap. This is an attendance rate cap on remote attendance only for this coming school year. So in-person attendance is not subject to this cap. So if we get to the place where we can have healthy in-person instruction, you can have many, many more kids as a fast growth school district show up, and you'll continue to receive additional funding for those students like you always would. And then of course, if you have additional students show up online, that's okay if your attendance rate does not exceed that of the rate from 2018-19. And more information about these caps, et cetera, can be found on these links. Okay, and then instructional delivery. Districts cannot ask for a student to commit to an instructional delivery method until the first 2 weeks before the start of school. This is one of those other things I put an asterisk by because it's unclear whether, under the current plans that will change or morph. And then districts must allow students to change instructional delivery settings each grading period. So you can't ask them to commit for an entire semester for one or the other. And then districts must allow remote learners to visit campus to complete course requirements that require physical engagement. So all of you that have welding or certain ag programs, for example, it's kind of hard to learn how to weld online. So they're requiring you to allow students to come for that. But then you can create local policies that limit remote learners from participating in UIL activities that require in-person instruction. So your cheerleading, your football, your band examples. So here are some questions that we have now that we've reviewed all of those pieces. All these additional expenses that people are going to incur in terms of sanitation and instruction. We saw some coverage for those the 19-20 school year, but TA was pretty firm about the limits of the dates for when those expenses could be incurred and haven't really said much of anything about this coming school year. And adequate funding for asynchronous instruction plans that are not approved after the first semester grace period. We hope that TEA will be pretty gracious in terms of approving those instructional plans. But if on the, outside event that everybody's at home and certain instructional plans just haven't been approved, that could really be a problematic thing for school districts, especially those that couldn't deploy synchronous instruction. And then funding impact for ADA adjustments made due to low attendance during the first 2 6 weeks attendance periods. We all know that those first 2 6 weeks, I think we count on those sometimes to get a little bit of a bump in our ADA, and the historical adjustments should account for some of that, but it may not account for all decreases. And of course, as a fast growth group, NIFA is funded due to attendance records. And so what does that look like given all of these different instructional streams? So I think we're doing all right on time. Kate, do we have any real short questions here that I can address before we move on to the next section?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. So Christopher Smith and Katie asked about, as you were talking about the hold harmless, doesn't the 1% drop make the hold harmless pretty much a non-issue for the ISDs on this call?
Yeah, I don't think it should be that big of a problem because the historical ratio should account it. I think the devil will be in the details. Like with this last year, that historical ratio did apply to all ADA and FTE groups. So for some of you, you may have seen some dips in special education, for example, or in other places. And of course, it's sort of the reverse this time because it'll be based on the end of the year. You know, I think, I don't know that it will be that big of an issue, but it's worth just kind of tracking what 1% less of your ADA would look like and just monitoring your funding as you go throughout the year. Chris. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and proceed, Kate, unless there's other questions we need to address.
Not at this time, but feel free, everyone, to drop in questions as we go, and we'll make sure we address them as needed.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, a lot of this will be some review, so I will go through it, but try to go through it somewhat quickly. That way we might have some time at the end when Dan talks to have a little bit of discussion about the what if scenarios. So again, we've got this CARES Act. It was the third of 4 stimulus packages delivered. We all dealt with this at the end of the school year when we had the ESSER funding, which is that second point there, come down to school districts. And then of course we have the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Funding that we've seen a little bit of that money come through with the PPE programming. And then also Texas received $6.2 billion through the Coronavirus Relief Fund. So you're all familiar with this list and the published ESSER fund entitlements for each district. TEA, of course, is supplanting the your regular program funding with this ESSER funds. And districts, hopefully you have already applied for this funding. And of course, it will come with extra reporting requirements, which many of you are dealing with. Like with other federal funding, districts will be subject to equitable service requirements. In case you missed it, the rules for these have been adapted to allow you several different options, depending on whether or not you want to apply this ESSER funding to Title I Part A students only, or whether you are going to use these funds on all your students. So I encourage you to look into those equitable service requirement changes or potential expansion, maybe is a better way of saying it, if you're still trying to figure out what to do with those. And they're federal funds, so of course EDGAR regulations apply, and time and effort reporting if staff are split funded. ESSER grant fund will require compliance reporting and quarterly reporting. The USD is allowing pre-award costs back to March 13th, and the funds need to be expended by the end of, not this school year, or the beginning, I should say, of school year 2022. Now, one of the things that we at Moat Casey have looked into, especially when it comes to applying ESSER funding to 1920 expenses, is whether you could just commit all of your ESSER fundings to staff funds for a particular pay period without having to worry about time and effort, and whether that would be allowed under these rules. We've gotten some fuzzy guidance from TEA, so sort of curious to see whether any of you who applied it to 1920 have gotten any confirmation from TEA about the validity of that. So examples of allowable costs, of course, providing principals and school leaders with resources necessary to address needs of individual schools, to address the unique needs of particular student populations, and activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of and continuity of services and LEAs. I think that's the one that I think a lot of people are citing as a reason to just take their huge pots of money and spend it on staff. I think that's probably the simplest way to do it, but it does require, I think a lot of districts would like some confirmation from TEA that would really work. So unallowable costs include construction, of course, child nutrition expenses, expenditures related to teachers' unions, executive salaries, or bonus merit pay bills. So then the Coronavirus Relief Fund, right? This is the separate money. And state leadership has announced that around 300 million of the state's CRF money can be accessed, and the application is expected to open here pretty shortly and close on September 15th. And the program will be run through the Texas Division of Emergency Management. So it's important that we'll be following kind of their rules on this, and I haven't heard a whole lot from TDM yet about how they're going to be managing these things, but we will keep our eyes peeled. Reimbursement is expected to be around 75% of eligible costs, although this may be reduced if too many school districts have huge bills that they'd like to be covered through this. Reimbursements will be capped at an amount, or they're anticipated to be capped at an amount equal to the greater of $50,000 or $250 per comp ed student. But we could, of course, see that reduced if we have oversubscription. To be allowable, reimbursements for necessary costs must have been incurred due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then must not be accounted for in the most recently approved budget as of March 27th, and be incurred through that particular period. So again, anything for next year is not subject to, unless you've purchased it, of course, during that time period, is not part of the program. So here's additional examples of allowable costs. Here is where you can spend money on distance learning. I know that we have that Operation Connectivity Survey that got sent out recently. I'm not sure what TEA's budget is for that, or whether that would come from more gear funding, or how they would plan to pay for that. Of course, payroll and benefit costs as well can be paid for with CRF funding. Here's additional unallowable costs, so basically anything else that has been covered by other federal or state funding. Payroll costs for those who weren't substantially dedicated to COVID-19 public health practices, damages covered by insurance, and then the state or the local share of the FEMA eligible expenses. And then if you're still trying to keep straight all of these different funds, we put together this little chart just to give you an idea of the rules associated with each one of these funding systems, and we'll be adding to this if additional funds are made available. So this is the last pot of money that seems to be kind of hanging out there. $3 billion total. Texas will be allocated $307 million, so not a huge amount of money. I know that they are using a portion of these funds to provide PPE to school districts. I'm not sure how many of you have actually received those or have that scheduled to be delivered to you yet, but private, nonprofit, equitable service requirements also apply. So what can we hope for maybe coming through the pipeline in the future? There's lots of talk about a phase 5. House Democrats have requested quite a bit of money for school district. The HEROES Act, written by House Democrats and passed in the chamber in May, allocates about $58 billion for districts, which is quite a bit more than what was passed through in some of these other relief funds. And then there's been a whole bunch of estimates that have been put out from various organizations that total at least around that $58 billion mark for colleges and schools, K-12 schools, to open safely. I'm sure you're all aware and feel that pain very much so. And there's additional people who think, like Senator Pat Murray of Washington, that this should be quite a bit higher. So where are we now? Specifically, the Council of Chief State School Officers say that schools will need between $158 billion to $245 billion. Some math from the School Administrators Association says that a school district will need 1.8 million. That's $25 billion nationwide. So lots of different data points and figures, but clearly more than what has been allocated right now. So I am happy to take any additional questions about those first two pieces, and then I'm going to turn this over to Dan to talk about where we go from here and kind of what the 87th session may hold going forward.
Catherine, I don't see any additional questions in the chat at this point, so we can probably move on. If there are any, please send them this way.
Great.
Catherine and Kate, thanks very much, and I appreciate y'all being here. And what we're going to go through, this is a really challenging time. I had a call this morning with the superintendent. He actually told me he's hoping I was calling and offering him a job to sell used cars because he was ready to jump this morning. I think the frustration he said he had is that he is tired of telling people that he gets asked by a parent, how are we going to handle this? Well, his response is, I don't know. And how principal, I don't know. And teacher, I don't know. And he calls some of his colleagues in other districts that he thinks are well run, and he finds out they're farther behind on these issues than he is. And so it's a frustrating, really frustrating time as far as how all this functions. But if we could, why don't we jump to the next state slide? I think one of the things coming up and to watch for on Monday, and we will cover it and send out any notes, anything come about, but the Legislative Budget Board is meeting. This is chaired by the Lieutenant Governor and Speaker, and then you've got your key committee chairs on there. And the Senate side, I think Finance and State Affairs, and then two others. I think Larry Taylor may be on it. And then on the House side, you've got Appropriations, Ways and Means, and then two other members. Last time they met was January of 2019 when they adopted the spending limit, did some other things. But at 10:45, they're supposed to meet on Monday. It's going to be in the House and Senate feeds. It's a virtual meeting, but Glenn Hager is going to outline where he thinks we're at in terms of revenue. I think that's key because this is challenging. If you look at where we are now and some of these projections and included in this slide, this is kind of as bad as things were back in the 2009-10, but particularly 2011 period. We seem to be in a little worse shape now. I think that on a personal level, the worst I ever experienced was in the mid 80s. I worked for the budget board. I worked on tax issues and then school finance. We passed the House Bill 72, the most recent, their big effort. I think probably that is most parallel to House Bill 3 as far as changes. But we were in dreadful shape with oil price declines or really collapses, savings and loans collapsing, and real estate collapsing. And so nothing was looking good. And if you were to look back at that period, I think that this one more corresponds to that than it really does even to what we had in the 9 through 11 time period here. And so it's challenging because the legislative response is going to be interesting. After that experience in 1987, they later appointed the Select Committee on Tax Equity, and they had an extensive series of hearings in the 89-90 time period, and it was after passage of a major tax bill in 1987 to keep the state afloat. That's what happened. And they did make some adjustments in taxes in 1991, and I've talked about this before. But Mike Reisig, the former deputy controller, said that was really the last time we've had a kind of coherent legislative discussion about here's our budget and here's how we go about paying for it. If you look at tax efforts since then, there have been things like, diverting sales tax money to the highway fund. There are a whole series of things we had. Obviously, in the 2006 period, we had the franchise tax, the business tax adjustments, and then rolling back rates. We've had some of those, but he said as far as any coherent discussion on the services that are being offered and how we're paying for them, in his view, his history, last time we've done that was 1991. Well, I think probably other than Tom Craddock and a few other members, there's nobody around that was here during that time period. So we've really not had that kind of discussion. If you want to go to the next one, Catherine. And if you look at some of the things that are happening sales tax wise, and I think if you're looking for probably the strongest monitor of how things are going on financially for the state, the sales tax is a pretty good one to watch because it will show you, it's kind of the best indicator as far as funding, probably roughly half of the general revenue budget that we have. But we're June year over average from last year, down about 6.5%. Now recall that a lot of business machinery, equipment, other kinds of things are subject to sales tax. And so when you see the oil patch and other things kind of headed south, that has a sales tax impact as well. It's not just franchise taxes, or not just severance taxes. If we go to the next page, you see, not surprisingly, with what's going on as far as oil and the natural gas prices were way down as far as the oil production and natural gas production taxes, and these feed into the rainy day fund as well. So we've seen that kind of a drop is quite significant in recent months, and there's some talk, and we've seen some indications that we're moving back above $40 in oil prices, or up in that range, or stabilizing. We'll see how that goes, but these things really kind of indicate the scope of this, I think, suggesting it's more major than most of what we've seen. If you go to the next one. So if you look at through June, and we compile this summary of what kind of projected growth there is and where we're at through the state fiscal year, sales tax obviously down year to date, anticipated to be about 3% higher. Motor vehicle sales taxes, well, there are people out there trying to sell cars, but I'm not sure if that's has big an impact. But obviously, natural gas production tax, and natural gas prices have stayed really low. Oil prices down. Alcoholic beverages, I thought since that was considered an essential service, that would have stayed higher, but we're still showing a decrease there, and cigarette and tobacco, and then motor fuels, and that's a quantity-based tax. So if there's less driving going on, that one's not going to stay very high. So we've got, go to the next one. We've got coming up, and the governor had asked, and other state leaders had asked state agencies to cut 5% of their budget. I believe this was a biennial figure. So if you get this in 3/4 of the way through the fiscal year and asked to cut 5% out for the biennium, it's going to be a greater cut than that. Now, they did exempt some things such as Foundation School Program, TRS contribution. Now, the TRS as an operating agency was not exempt from that, but that's roughly going to do that. This is consistent. If I go back to my 1986-87 experience, in 86 they met and probably cut $500 million out of their budget at that time, much smaller budget, but that following kind of the same pattern, looking for things that were essentially not going to meet the funding that they had appropriated at the time, or forcing cuts and other things. But that's where we're at initially on the cut issue.
Dan, if you don't mind, I'm just going to insert a comment here for a second. We've reached out to TEA staff several times to get their take on what they were going to deliver to in terms of what their cuts were going to be. And they issued back a very short reply, about a paragraph long, that didn't include any specific figures. So remains to be seen exactly what this will look like in terms of individual program cutting.
Yeah, and I had tried to look for that before the meeting. I couldn't find any reference on it, so I'm glad I just didn't miss it. So there wasn't anything much to read. But I think that these kinds of cuts are always the starting point on this. And if you've got anything easy you can give up, you normally do during this first round of cutting exercise. But then what's going to happen, let's go to the next slide. What's going to happen next is that we've got this meeting on I think really key, we'll see what will drive some of this. And I tried to look for the appropriations request instructions, and I couldn't find where those had been issued at this point. But what they're going to do is issue the directives to the agencies. And normally in the past, what they've done is some layers of cuts, where you'd be if you're cutting 5% or 10% or 15%. That information is useful, but I don't think it really drives the train ultimately. But they will start, I think, in August, and it may get pushed a little bit. A legislative appropriations request, because they need the budget, particularly the budget board, and then also the governor's budget operation are involved as well. Really need that information in coming up with an appropriations bill, which they will typically get done, in December. But I think a lot of the decision making as far as how they're going to handle things is really going to be driven by what the controller says on Monday. I think that's going to drive the train for the next some odd months, and probably drive some of the appropriations requests. If you go on, Catherine, and go on to the next couple here, we've got a consistent message, and this parallels my 86-87 experience, and to some extent we thought we saw some of that in at least in 2009, but not as much. But that in 86-87 they just passed a massive school finance reform bill. And I think the key element to that was it made major efforts at equalizing state funding out there, because I think one of the things that became evident through the Edgewood cases, I mean, we had, and it's an extreme example, but we had a 700-to-1 disparities in wealth as far as what could be raised. And I think you can't look back at that era and not come to the conclusion that property poor districts were severely underfunded under the system that existed prior to that changes in 1984. And so they committed to funding that, and we really didn't go through any cuts, but in exchange for that, they ended up passing a fairly large tax bill in 1987. We've got the same kind of commitment here. It's hard to take a bill, you know, you had a bill that passed both houses unanimously, I think, and rightfully heralded as major, clearly as major reform. And in terms of fast growth districts, I'm not sure this was all pluses, because you know, losing the cost of education index, but particularly losing current year values and the rest, I think made you more dependent upon transition aid or the fast growth allotment or other kinds of things to try to make up some of those funding sources. But it was a major effort. And then I think part of it is to the state's commitment. A lot of the state's commitment in that bill is to tax relief and forcing taxes down if value growth continues. So I think we're going to see probably a really unique session coming ahead as far as how they're going to handle this, and they don't have a lot of experience making these kinds of reductions. If you go to the next one, Catherine. Yeah, you've got some, and then this is Senator Nelson saying, well, she's going to start, you know, regardless of what gets submitted as far as budget requests, her plan is to start at zero for every agency that comes before them. When I worked for the budget board, the one agency you didn't want to be involved in, this is actually, the board used to actually meet, have 5 or 6 meetings during the summer and into the fall, where they would review, the actual budget board itself would review all the agency appropriations requests. And the one you didn't want to be with was the Board of Public Accountancy, because that was an Article 1 and that was the first A agency. And even though they received little or no general revenue fund, they used to spend the better part of an afternoon scrutinizing their budget. And that was the kind of stuff that went on at the time. We don't have that level of detail now, but I think that from the standpoint of what Senator Nelson's saying here is they're going to look at every agency from top to bottom, and the various levels of cuts and other things they described may be informational, good for informational purposes, but they're going to take a hard look at this. But the only way you do that is to look at the services you're providing and what level of service you can provide and afford to provide. And that's a challenging part. Go ahead, and then we've got Chairman Huberty that has made a strong commitment to keeping the House Bill 3 gains that have been made, and I think that's a proper position for him as kind of as a House sponsor of this, and I think that's not too surprising. Go next. Now, as far as general revenue surplus, what you see here is that we got, they were estimating at the end of last session about a $2.9 billion surplus related to revenue to appropriations. And this is, I think, what we'll get some semblance on this on Monday will be what's that going to look like coming out of this biennium. And then you can almost certainly, it's probably going to be in the negative category. The Economic Stabilization Fund or Rainy Day Fund, current fund balance is estimated to be about $7.5 billion, which we're a lot better off with that $7.5 billion than no billion as far as that fund goes, but that's going to be hard to stretch that. At least they've gotten around to where they're starting to appropriate some of that money. For a long time, it was kind of viewed as the holy grail of school finance, and you couldn't touch it for anything. But I think we're in one of those moments where we can. The other thing that's mentioned here, and we looked at some of the options. This goes back, if you go back to 2011, I believe we've done this several times. Because the state operates on a cash basis, as silly as it sounds, you can transfer at the end of the biennium, you can transfer an August payment until September, and it moves it into the next biennium. And so what you do is, they did this many years ago with state employee pay. It used to get paid at the end of the month, and they started paying it the first of the month, and that pushed all this in, pushed a month's salary into the next biennium. But they did this in 2011 and then rescinded it in 2013 because they were in much better shape. So I don't think it ever got enacted in 2013, but we've had other times where it has. But one of the estimates we've had is you do that, you pick up about $2 billion. I mean, I think that that's the kind of thing you're going to see on the table in this next budget discussion, those kinds of things. The other possible things you're going to look at, you know, if there's some way to cut instructional materials, facilities, they do so little on facilities right now in terms of, if you look at our IFA and EDA programs and how those have shrunk when they basically kept them largely static, there's not a lot there. But instructional materials, they may. You recall when they, in 2011, one of the things they looked at was the regular program adjustment factor, where they basically made adjustments without trying to ding, I think at that time, the special program allotments, but some variant on that may come about and viewed as be the equitable way of cutting funding if they get into that position where they have that. Now you've got some other elements of FSP, and you recall the commitments you made to salaries and other kinds of things. You know, I don't know how the extent you can backtrack on that, but I think more the incentive pay and other kinds of things, although that I think that's very near and dear to the commissioner's heart. I think it make it very difficult to cut that back on that, but there are some elements to that that are there. Go ahead. You know, we've got, well, we just don't know right now how this session is going to shake out. I mean, there have been some committee hearings. You know, we were looking at thinking there'd be some action this spring, where it never happened, or where we've got some of the stuff. Some of these committees may happen in September. I think what's going to happen post-September, you're for, at least for all the House members, half the senators, and you're in a you know, you're in an election cycle right there. So I think anything that's not done by September probably has to wait until post-election to have that happen. One of the things, you know, since Speaker Bonin did not seek re-election, you're going to have new leadership in the House one way, shape, or form. And it probably, I mean, it's going to depend on the makeup of the House. Is it still a Republican majority or not, or do they make some kind of arrangements? And the other thing on here, we've got, and I was at a small district the other night, and I said, well, you know, we used to always think that we'd win out over Health and Human Services and other things as far as funding needs, and I'm not so sure we went out on that. I'm not sure we're a higher priority than some of those public health needs that we see going on right now. Redistricting, I think there are some issues there, because I think they're delaying the census results and pushing that forward. They used to come fairly early in the session, and not a lot typically happened in redistricting sections, because if you're not paying attention to it as a member, you know, you may not have a seat to go back to in the next election cycle. So we'll see what happens on that. I think some of the police reform, criminal justice reform topics are certainly going to come front and center during the session. So there's going to be other priorities out there. But I think the budget is going to be front and center as far as how they handle that. I think that's going to be the key element, and we'll see how things emerge. As I said, I think the most important thing going on immediately is the controller's public pronouncements on Monday afternoon, and we'll track all that and get some notes on it just as quick as it happens, and others will too, I think. But I think that's when it's on it. 10:45, as they have it posted, they said there are going to be House and Senate feeds online to that. It's a virtual meeting. They're not actually meeting. So it's I think that's the most significant thing. But I think that'll probably start the guidance as far as how they're going to handle the budget in the next cycle. But I think this is a challenging time. It'll be interesting to see how the state leadership responds to this, because there isn't anybody there that's been through this to this extent before. I think this unfortunately surpasses what we had in 2011. We had earlier part of the 2000s some other challenges, but I go back to the mid 80s is the last time I can think things were this badly in the ditch financially. So we'll try to answer any questions or anything else we have. We certainly appreciate your willingness to check in on this and participate, and we're going to try to do some things like this in the future. I think that this is helpful. We appreciate the opportunity to work with the Fast Growth School Coalition, have for a long time, and that's the other thing I should mention as we go through this. You know, there are going to be hearings on I mentioned the budget hearings that they'll have in in the fall or late summer or fall. I think it's important as an association to go on record for those things that you want to preserve. So there's some indication in the record that we're there. And I think there was a lot of unhappiness over the fast growth adjustment that we had, because I mean, in some of these cases, when you look, you saw some districts scoring from 125 to 135 over a couple of years. I don't exactly think of that as fast growth, but that's under the formula TA came up with. That's the kind of thing that was evolving. By the same token, I've had talked to several of you that if you hadn't gotten that fast growth adjustment that you got, you pretty much would have gotten shut out of increased funding altogether with the move to current year values, with the loss of the CEI, some other things, and so it was significant. So we've got to look at that carefully from the standpoint of the members of the coalition, and make sure we're on record on things and try to support them. Because the other aspect about this is that anytime they're in a state budget crunch like this, things like transition funding and the rest, things that they don't think are, they don't view as permanent adjustments to the program, are often subject to getting scaled back or being the victims of these kinds of budget cuts. And so they try to preserve what they can for teacher salaries, other kinds of things. But if you're counting heavily in transition aid or other kinds of things, you can oftentimes see proposals to scale those back or even eliminate those kinds of things, saying, well, you've had transition enough for the first 2 years and we're not going to do anything else. So we have to watch that pretty carefully, and particularly from the standpoint of fast growth membership, and make sure they're not getting dinged, or at least they don't have legislators walking into uninformed is what the consequence is for you. So we'll stay on top of that and watch that. But I would suggest getting on the record with that, any opportunity, budget hearings, if there's something going on at the state board, any form that we have, to be sure we're on the record.
Thank you, Dan. We have about 8 minutes left for any questions that anyone might have. We have, of course, the chat feature as well as a question and answer feature at the bottom. So please feel free to throw any questions in there. Maybe while we're waiting for a few questions to emerge, Dan or Catherine, as you have worked with superintendents and school districts as they're preparing for the next school year, is there anything that we haven't covered here today that maybe you hear as issues or questions or concerns that seem to be coming up a lot? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one thing, and I think this group probably has it pretty well covered, but just also, while we're certainly focused on back to school reopening plans and how ADA will be counted, I think we also have to remember the requirements that have been placed on us under House Bill 3, and just to keep the regular, wheels on the bus moving. So for example, like keeping an eye on your tax compression and making sure that you've got the paperwork and all of your values ready to go to get your figures placed into the local property value system, which TEA is going to open up here in just a couple of days. Remember to check on, by August 5th, TEA should have confirmed your submitted calculations or corrected them as the case may be, and author your tier 1 rate. So again, just as a reminder for that system out there, some of you maybe are ready to go, but I've seen some districts have a lot of questions about how to work through those numbers.
Well, the one observation I have, there's probably more confusion out there than I can recall in a year at the professional level. I mean, the one that got me is the day I printed out the 17-page document that started with synchronous and asynchronous learning and the rest. And I watched a lot of action movies, and I thought, well, what would Chuck Norris or Jason Bourne do if they got something handed to them like this? I said, they'd probably blow up the building, but I don't recommend that as a solution. But I think that we've had a real challenge as far as just trying to stay on top of this stuff. And then it's a moving dynamic between, in our county, we've got a county imposing various restrictions on things, which I think is what stopped the football teams here from practicing yesterday after some edict from the county on Tuesday. I'm still trying to sort that out, but we've got no end of helpful hands out there, and I think just trying to stay on top of this has probably been the biggest challenge. I think if you ask anybody what's your ADA going to be here going to be next year or the year after, it's a bit of a challenge to try to figure that out in the context of these various scenarios. And I'm really I really want to recognize the folks that are working on this, and I think doing a very good job staying on top of this, because it's as significant a professional challenge as I've seen, trying to stay on top of this, and they've done an admirable job.
Thanks, Dan. We have a question in the chat box. You mentioned synchronous and asynchronous learning. With the synchronous model of remote learning, wouldn't each child in a family with multiple students need to have their own device? We have had this conversation about connectivity and availability to devices. That was included in the letter that we signed on to, that topic of conversation. Can we, would either of you want to expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. On synchronous, I guess if I were putting on my administrator's hat, knowing that synchronous does have to happen in real time, I would take account of the students that I had in the same household, and see kind of what grades those students tend to be patterned. You know, maybe 3rd and 5th grade, 1st and 3rd grade, you know, a lot of kids 2 years apart, and maybe schedule class hours according, you know, so that they're not happening concurrently. I think that could be a way. I mean, obviously that adds hugely to the administrative burden of trying to make sure that you're not having school happen at the same time. But remember, it's based upon instructional minutes, which could be as few as 3 hours for some students. So that might be a way to help with that.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, I mean, it would make sense that you should have your own units. I think one of the problems, I was at a rural district, West Texas district, Tuesday night, and they've tried internet hotspots with buses and other kinds of things, and it's just not functioning for a lot of their kids. I mean, basically you have to come and park your car near the bus if you're going to do any work, and that's just not viable for educational purposes for any period of time. And so it's just I think maybe one of the topics we're going to see in this legislative session that's tough to do in a non-money session, but I think is some type of a state program as far as affording internet access to the entire state or the bulk of the state, because there's just a lot of places where it's just not happening. And I think the Wall Street Journal, I didn't get to read it yet, but had a featured front page story this morning about how some of this online stuff is just not working, particularly for low-income kids and others, and I think that adds to that challenge, and particularly if you don't have access to start with, and it's very hard to make it work. Is my personal observation.
Yeah, and I would add to Dan to that, so the current tiers that comp ed funding is based on, those the data that informs the level of severity of economic disadvantage of certain block groups is based upon census data, and one of the pieces of census data is whether or not a family has internet access. That piece is not part of the current comp ed funding calculation. So perhaps bringing that to the comp ed committee as a unique and certainly pertinent addition to those calculations.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you, Dan. We are right at time. Thank you so much to both of you for bringing all this information to us and for sharing your expertise on it. To everyone else, thank you for joining us today. We hope this was helpful and useful. We look forward to doing more in the future, so please watch for alerts about those. But we send you off for now, and thanks so much for joining, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. It was good to see you today.
Thanks.